our challenge on this panel, as you remind us, Paolo, is also at the beginning to articulate a positive agenda. And so I do want to bring in some of the economic and the state-building elements that you referred to, as well as the security. And I will speak somewhat more from an EU perspective, as we have ministers here who will speak from the Middle East and North African perspective and have done already. Just something about the context first, from my perspective, because context is important before we get to specifics or even principles. We've spoken a lot throughout these last 2 days about the deep nature of the challenges facing the Middle East and North Africa. And Michael Kohler yesterday from the European Commission reminded us in one of our sessions, we could have had the same conversation 25 years ago. It's the same set of challenges that are being faced in terms of the inability to drive growth for growing populations at a socio-economic level. And the rest of the world is passing the region by. This is becoming unsustainable because there is a global political awakening taking place in all parts of the world, including throughout North Africa and the Middle East. And people, in a way, will not accept not having enough. They want governments that can be at least accountable, if not democratic by standards that we in Europe might think of as democratic. And failing governments have led to failed states. And failed states lead to the rise of Islamic State. And we need to be aware of those risks. We should also remember, of course, that we have our own problems in Europe as well, and we haven't talked about those as much, especially those that share the southern border of the Mediterranean, high youth unemployment, aging demographics, and low growth rates. And I thought Mauro Moretti of Finmeccanica put it very well yesterday when he said, prosperity will be the property of the two shores of the Mediterranean, or there will be no prosperity for either. That struck me as a very powerful comment, but I think you could also add, there will be security on the two shores of the Mediterranean, or there will be no security for either. And we need to understand that our fates, in a way, are linked together. And the blend of migration, the way that migration has now been used and abused to bring terrorism into Europe as well, reminds us of this risk. And I think it reminds us of the importance of what Federica Mogherini said yesterday, that in a way this is a problem for all of the EU, not just for the south of the EU. But I think we must also recognize that change really lies in the hands of the governments and the peoples of North Africa and the Middle East, as has been explained here. The failures, by the way, are not Europe's failures always. And we blame ourselves, I think, in Europe a lot for what goes wrong there. It is not entirely our position. Without the offer of enlargement, the EU has limited leverage. And we keep forgetting, I think, this fact. And we're not going to be able to push rule of law, transparency, stronger political systems, civil society, as much as we believe those are important, without the leverage of enlargement. Now, Minister Messahel said we need to think about collective security, sécurité collective. But I think we must recognize something here. We think about security differently in many cases. The reality is many governments in Europe feel that governments in North Africa and the Middle East have been governed badly, and that bad governance leads to insecurity. Why is it that people were so quick in the Western governments to support the overthrow of Gaddafi, to support the overthrow of Mubarak, to support the overthrow of Assad? Because ultimately they thought that the tracks they were on were wrong. So if many governments then think we don't understand their security and that we don't understand the dangers they face, we are coming at this from quite a fundamentally different standpoint. And I think this is a very important point to think about. So on what to do, let me just say a few things about principles. I've got experts, colleagues of mine at Chatham House, including Claire Spencer, who's here, who know the region much better than I do. But in terms of principles, I think the EU is going to have to, therefore, develop a differentiated strategy. This has been mentioned in many cases. It's at the heart of the new European neighborhood policy. Richard Young's Habib Essid, I think the Tunisian Prime Minister himself, talked about the need for a different type of neighborhood policy, one that differentiates between regions, but also between countries. Focus on security where security is weak. Focus on economic potential where the security at least is strong enough. I think the role of the European Commission and the whole economic agenda is going to be absolutely essential. Trade concessions must be pursued. There's a phrase that my colleague Claire Spencer developed about thinking of common cause. You're not going to have a rich south of Europe without a rich south of the Mediterranean. Those two things are interlinked. Ultimately, the economic future, I think, of the southern parts of Europe are linked to the economic success of the southern parts of the Mediterranean. But trying to go for things like deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, these are, in a way, too detailed, too specified. There's too much emphasis on forcing those governments to go towards the acquis of changing regulations, changing laws, when these governments are not committed yet to wanting to make those changes because they think they might make them less secure. So we need to think of a kind of different approach, one that's more graduated economically, one that doesn't make conditionality in areas where we cannot deliver conditionality absolutely central. And the phrase more for more, when we don't have that much more money we want to offer, again, I think doesn't entirely capture the situation. I do believe strongly with Miguel Ángel Moratinos that money and investment is absolutely critical. He talked about having a bank focused on the region. I think the European Investment Bank, even the EBRD, are heading in the right kinds of directions. But their aid in some cases probably will need to be conditional because you're talking about EU members' taxpayer money when you're applying it here. Now, on specifics, again, maybe I'm going to be a little bit Britishly pragmatic here and point out a few very specific areas. I thought that the energy conversation yesterday was particularly important. Energy diversification, thinking about the way that solar energy, renewables offer amazing potential for countries in North Africa, and be able to take energy into Europe, which needs diversification, is a real opportunity. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that energy is not going to serve as the kind of regional integrator the way the European coal and steel community did for the European Union. I thought Fatih Birol got this absolutely right at the time. Again, we're probably going to have to think country by country in a very specific, particular ways. I think it might be important as well to think about how you do border easing, working together on environmental strategies. A lot of the regional changes that are taking place in the region. I'm struck, again, by Mr. Misahel saying that between Algeria and Libya, we don't necessarily have workers in that part of the country. We don't have too much engagement. We're worried about security. That's amazing for countries in Europe. The level of lack of integration across North Africa between those countries. How can we start to build that in a more effective way? Then we come, I think, a little bit to thinking about security. Michael Lee, who's a great expert, used to work in the European Commission, a Brit, has talked about the idea of worrying as much about the neighbors of our neighbors as about our neighbors. How do we integrate countries such as Iraq, but also Chad, Sudan, Mali, Niger? These are countries that if they are unstable, we're going to find the instability in North Africa will persist beyond it. So thinking beyond just our near neighborhood is absolutely essential. Let me do last 3 points in 1.5 minutes. One is education. It's declining. You've taken 3 seconds away from me there. One is on the issue of education. I think education is going to be absolutely critical in North Africa for its ability to be able to help the next generation feel they have opportunities for the future. The way that European countries can potentially help them in that area, I think, will be absolutely essential as well. So my concluding comments, which won't be as exciting and as uplifting, I think, of Miguel Ángel Moratinos are that the future of the Middle East and North Africa ultimately is the responsibility of its peoples and its governments. Europe can help as much as it can. It needs to maintain a collective focus on that part of the region. But the migration debate right now could change the whole context for how Europe thinks about it. Migration is changing the politics inside Europe. It is leading to the rise of populist parties. Unless European governments are able to start to think about their neighborhood and also about their borders and how they manage the borders and sustain the confidence of their publics, that they know how to look after their security, we're not going to be able to develop an effective partnership with our neighbors in North Africa and the Middle East. Halim Desir said yesterday, in the EU, you can't choose in Europe whether to be a country of immigration or not. We're destined to have it. But in that case, governments need to know how they can manage that process of integration. And that means also focusing on inclusion, and absorption of the citizens from North Africa and the Middle East into societies in Europe. If we do not know how to turn them into citizens and not just immigrants, then what I fear is that Europe will continue to securitize its relationship with North Africa and not take advantage of the opportunities of economic integration that I described earlier, which would be fantastic for both. So I'll stop there.